The smoke was so thick in the cabin that Fiona Vaughn barely saw her hand in front of her face, but she smelled the disaster immediately, her father's last pot, the only decent cookware left to her name, filled with blackened stew that looked like something dredged from a tar pit. She stood there in her small homestead outside Jackson, Wyoming, in the summer of 1882. Tears streaming down her soot-covered cheeks, not just from the acrid smoke, but from the crushing weight of everything that had gone wrong in the 3 months since she had buried her father beside her mother on the hillside overlooking their land. 22 years old and alone in a territory that did not forgive weakness, she had tried so hard to keep the small cattle operation running, to maintain the 100 acres her parents had worked themselves into early graves to claim. But she could not even manage to cook a simple stew without burning it beyond recognition. The sound of hooves outside made her freeze, one hand still gripping the ruined pot with a wet rag, the other wiping futilely at her tear-streaked face. She was not expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors in Wyoming territory could mean trouble as easily as help. Through the open door, left ajar to let out the smoke, she saw a tall man dismount from a dusty sorrel horse, his broad-brimmed hat shadowing his face until he stepped onto her porch and removed it, revealing dark hair and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. "Madam, I saw the smoke from the ridge and thought there might be trouble," he said, his voice deep and concerned. "Are you all right?" Fiona wanted to tell him she was fine, to send him on his way with thanks for his concern, but instead a fresh sob escaped her throat and she gestured helplessly at the pot in her hands. "I cannot even feed myself," she said, the words coming out in a rush of humiliation and despair. "I have been trying all day and I burned it. I burned the whole thing, and it was the last of the beef and vegetables I had put by, and now there is nothing." The man stepped into the cabin without invitation, but something about his manner made it seem less like an intrusion, and more like the natural action of someone who saw a problem that needed solving. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with a weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors, and a solid, capable build that came from hard physical labor. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well-maintained, and when he looked at the pot in her hands, his expression was thoughtful rather than disgusted. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the pot. She handed it to him, too exhausted and defeated to question what he intended. He set it on the table, found a spoon hanging on the wall, and scooped up a portion of the blackened stew. The chunks of meat and potatoes were charred on the outside, the liquid reduced to a thick, dark gravy that looked entirely inedible. Fiona watched in horror as he brought the spoon to his lips and took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and then took another. "This is delicious," he said, and his tone was so sincere that she almost believed him. "You are lying to make me feel better," she said, but her tears had stopped, replaced by bewilderment. He shook his head and took another spoonful. "No, madam, I am not. It is burned, that is true, but underneath that, I can taste good beef seasoned well and the vegetables are cooked through. The burned part just adds a smoky flavor, like when you cook over a campfire. I have eaten far worse on the trail, I promise you that." He pulled out one of the 2 chairs at her small table and sat down, continuing to eat the stew with apparent enjoyment. Fiona stood there, stunned, watching this stranger consume her ruined dinner as though it were a feast. After a moment, he looked up at her and smiled, a warm expression that transformed his serious face into something unexpectedly kind. "My name is Daniel Quinn," he said between bites. "I have been riding through looking for work. I heard in town that some of the smaller ranches might need hands with the summer season in full swing." Fiona sank into the other chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Fiona Vaughn," she said automatically. "This is the Vaughn homestead, or what is left of it. I'm afraid I cannot afford to hire anyone. I can barely afford to feed myself, as you have witnessed." Daniel finished the stew, scraping the pot clean in a way that would have seemed rude from anyone else but somehow felt like a compliment to her cooking, or at least to her attempt at it. "Where is your family?" he asked gently. "Dead," she said flatly, too tired to soften the truth. "My mother 4 years ago, my father this past April. He went out to check on the cattle during a late storm and caught pneumonia. I nursed him for 2 weeks, but he did not recover." "I am sorry," Daniel said, and the simple words carried genuine sympathy. "And you have been running this place alone since then?" "Trying to," she said. "Failing at it more accurately. I can handle the cattle well enough. I grew up doing that work, but everything else keeps falling apart. The roof leaks, the fence needs mending, and apparently I cannot cook anymore without burning the house down." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with those amber eyes. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "I need work and a place to stay for the summer at least, maybe longer. You need help keeping this place running. I will work for room and board, no wages required, until we see if this arrangement suits us both. If it does, we can discuss payment when you sell your cattle in the fall." Fiona stared at him, her mind racing through all the reasons this was a terrible idea. She did not know this man, could not simply invite him to live on her property based on nothing more than his kind face and his willingness to eat burned stew. But the alternative was continuing as she had been, watching the homestead slowly fall apart around her until she lost everything her parents had built. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "There is a bunkhouse," she said slowly. "It is small, just 1 room, but it has a stove and a bed. My father built it thinking he would hire men as the operation grew." "That sounds perfect," Daniel said. "I can start today if you would like. That fence I saw on my way in looks like it could use attention before any cattle get ideas about wandering." Something in Fiona's chest loosened, a knot of tension she had been carrying for months. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You could find work at any of the larger ranches that would pay you proper wages." Daniel stood and picked up his hat from the table, turning it in his hands. "My father lost his farm when I was 17, he said quietly. "He tried to keep it running alone after my mother passed, but he could not manage it. We lost everything, and he never really recovered from that loss. He died 2 years later, broken in spirit. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone in a similar situation, I would take it." The honesty in his voice made Fiona's throat tight. "I will show you to the bunkhouse," she said, rising from her chair. "And Daniel, thank you for the kindness and for the lie about the stew." He grinned at her, and she felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with relief about the help he was offering. "It was not entirely a lie," he said. "I have tasted worse." Over the following days, Fiona discovered that Daniel Quinn was a man of his word and then some. He rose before dawn to check the cattle, spending long hours riding the property to ensure none had strayed or fallen ill. He repaired the sagging fence line with efficiency born of experience, replaced the rotted boards on the porch, and patched the leaking roof with materials he somehow procured from town using his own money, despite her protests. In the evenings, he would return to the main cabin for dinner, and Fiona found herself taking extra care with the cooking, determined to prove that the burned stew had been an aberration rather than a representation of her skills. They fell into an easy routine, working side by side during the day and talking late into the evening over simple meals. Daniel told her about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to break horses from his father, and to track game from his uncle. About the years he had spent drifting west after his father's death, working ranches and cattle drives across Kansas and Colorado before making his way to Wyoming. Fiona shared her own stories about growing up as an only child on an isolated homestead, about her mother's gentle nature and her father's stubborn determination to make something of their land, about the loneliness that had settled over her like a shroud after his death. "I thought about selling," she admitted one night as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the Teton Range, the mountains turning gold and purple in the fading light. "Going back east to St. Louis where my mother's sister lives. But this land, it is all I have left of them. Their sweat and blood is in every acre. I cannot just abandon it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the horizon. "Land has a way of claiming people," he said finally. "My father used to say that once you work a piece of ground, really work it with your own hands, it becomes part of you. You are right to fight for it." She looked at him in the twilight, at the strong profile and the calloused hands resting on his knees, and felt something shift inside her, a recognition that went beyond gratitude or friendship. She had been alone for so long, carrying the weight of the homestead and her grief without anyone to share the burden, and now here was this man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had been too proud to voice. "Why have you never settled anywhere?" she asked. "You clearly know how to run a ranch. You could have your own place." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a loneliness that matched her own. "I suppose I have been waiting to find somewhere that felt like home," he said. "Somewhere worth staying for." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something unspoken but profound. Fiona felt her breath catch, but before she could respond, a sound from the direction of the cattle pen made them both turn. Daniel was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the rifle he kept propped beside the door. "Stay here," he said, but Fiona was already moving, grabbing her father's old shotgun from inside the cabin. "This is my land," she said firmly. "I am not hiding while someone else defends it." They moved together through the growing darkness toward the pens, where the cattle were making distressed noises. As they approached, Fiona saw a flash of movement, something low and swift, and then Daniel's rifle cracked through the night. A wolf yelped and retreated, and a moment later Fiona heard the sounds of the pack withdrawing into the forest beyond the cleared land. "They will be back," Daniel said, lowering his rifle. "Wolves are persistent when they find easy prey. We need to reinforce these pens and take turns keeping watch at night." For the next week, they worked to fortify the cattle pens and establish a watch rotation. Fiona took the early evening hours while Daniel slept, and he took over past midnight until dawn. The wolves tested their defenses twice more, but each time they were driven back by rifle fire. The work was exhausting, added to everything else that needed doing, but Fiona found herself grateful for Daniel's presence more than ever. She tried to imagine facing the wolves alone, losing cattle she could not afford to replace, and could not fathom how she would have managed. One night, as she sat by the fire pit they had built near the pens, Daniel emerged from the bunkhouse earlier than expected and sat down beside her. "I could not sleep," he said. "Thought I would keep you company instead." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the wilderness around them. The stars overhead were brilliant, undimmed by any human light beyond their small fire, and Fiona thought about how different her life was from the women she had known in her mother's stories of St. Louis, with their fine dresses and social calls and lives lived entirely indoors. "Do you ever regret staying here?" Daniel asked, as though reading her thoughts. "This is a hard life, especially for a woman alone." "I am not alone anymore," she said without thinking, and then felt heat rise to her face as she realized what she had implied. Daniel reached over and took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers. "No," he agreed quietly. "You are not." Fiona's heart hammered in her chest as she looked at him, at the way the firelight played across his features, making shadows dance in the hollows of his cheeks and throat. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long are you planning to stay? How long do you want me to?" he asked, and the intensity in his gaze made her feel like the ground was shifting beneath her. "I want you to stay," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not just for the summer, not just for help with the ranch. I want you to stay because I cannot imagine this place without you anymore. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent shivers down her spine despite the warm summer night. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. "Because I fell in love with you sometime between eating that terrible stew and fixing your roof, and I have been trying to figure out how to tell you without scaring you off." Fiona laughed, a sound of pure joy that startled the nearest cattle. "It was not that terrible," she protested weakly. But she was already moving closer to him, drawn by a force she could not name but had no desire to resist. Daniel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were falling. "It was pretty terrible," he said with a smile. "But I would eat it again every day for the rest of my life if it meant being with you." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey through darkness. Fiona wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she had been carrying, all the hope and fear and desperate need for connection. The fire crackled beside them, the cattle settled into sleep, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, but none of it mattered because she was in Daniel's arms and nothing had ever felt so right. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Jackson, with the minister's wife and the general store owner serving as witnesses. Fiona wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, and Daniel wore a new suit he had purchased with money saved from his traveling days. The ceremony was simple, but when Daniel slipped a gold band on her finger and promised to love her for the rest of his days, Fiona felt a happiness she had thought lost to her forever. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Daniel's experience and Fiona's intimate knowledge of the land and cattle proved to be a formidable combination. They added to their herd slowly but steadily, purchasing young stock when prices were favorable and breeding their cows with careful attention to quality. Daniel proved to have a gift for horse trading as well, and within 2 years, they had expanded their operation to include a string of working horses that were in high demand among the other ranchers in the valley. Their first child, a son they named David, was born in the spring of 1884 during a late snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Daniel delivered the baby himself with hands that shook but never faltered, and when he placed the squalling infant in Fiona's arms, she saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "He is perfect," Daniel whispered, kissing her forehead. "You are perfect. I cannot believe this is my life." Fiona looked up at her husband, at the man who had eaten her burned stew and stayed to build a life with her, and felt such overwhelming love that she could barely speak. "This is our life," she managed to say, "and it is only beginning." David was followed by a daughter, Ellen, 2 years later, and then another son, Thomas, 2 years after that. The cabin that had once seemed so empty now rang with the sounds of children's laughter and running feet. Daniel added rooms to accommodate their growing family, building with the same careful attention he brought to everything he did. Fiona taught the children to ride as soon as they could walk, and Daniel showed them how to care for the animals and the land with respect and skill. The years were not without challenges. A harsh winter in 1887 killed a dozen head of cattle, and a drought the following summer left them struggling to keep the remaining animals fed and watered. But they faced each hardship together, supporting each other through the difficulties and celebrating the triumphs. Their ranch became known throughout the valley as a place of quality livestock and honest dealing, and the Vaughn name, which Fiona had insisted on keeping alongside Quinn, became respected in the community. On their 10th anniversary, Daniel took Fiona up to the hillside where her parents were buried, where wildflowers now grew thick in the spring and summer. He had carved a new headstone for them, replacing the rough wooden cross that had weathered away, and beside it, he had placed a bench he had built from strong pine. "I wanted to do this for you," he said as they sat together looking out over the valley, their ranch visible in the distance with the children playing in the yard under the watchful eye of the woman they had hired to help with the household work now that the operation had grown. "Your parents gave you this land, and you fought to keep it. Everything we have built is because of their sacrifice and your strength." Fiona leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and wood smoke and sun-warmed skin. "Everything we have built is because you stopped that day," she said. "Because you saw smoke and came to help, and because you were kind enough to eat the worst stew ever made and tell me it was delicious." Daniel laughed, the sound rich and warm. "I have a confession to make," he said. "That stew really was terrible, possibly the worst thing I have ever put in my mouth. But the woman crying over it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I would have eaten anything to make her smile." Fiona sat up and looked at him in mock outrage. "You lied to me." "I did," he admitted, grinning. "And I would do it again in a heartbeat. That terrible stew brought me to the best thing that ever happened to me." She kissed him then, long and deep, a kiss that still held all the passion of their early days but was enriched now by the years of partnership and shared experience. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Fiona Quinn," he said. "I loved you when you were a grieving woman who could not cook to save her life, and I love you now as the strong, capable partner who runs this ranch with me. I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if there is anything beyond." "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Daniel. Not just the ranch, but me. You saved me from drowning in grief and loneliness, and you gave me a reason to keep fighting." They sat together on the bench as the sun moved across the sky, talking about their plans for the future, about adding more land to the ranch and maybe starting to raise sheep alongside the cattle, about the children and what they might become when they grew. David was already showing an aptitude for working with horses that reminded Fiona of Daniel, while Ellen had a head for figures that suggested she might one day manage the business side of the operation. Thomas was still too young to show his inclinations, but he had a gentle nature that seemed to draw animals to him. As the afternoon faded into evening and they made their way back down the hillside toward home, Daniel suddenly stopped and pulled Fiona into his arms. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For giving me a home," he said. "For giving me a family. For giving me a reason to stay in one place and build something lasting. I spent so many years drifting, never belonging anywhere, and now I cannot imagine being anywhere but here with you." Fiona felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from joy rather than sorrow. "You gave me the same things," she said. "We saved each other, I think." They walked hand in hand back to the ranch house, where the children spotted them and came running, shouting about the adventures of their day. Daniel scooped up Thomas and settled him on his shoulders while Fiona took Ellen's hand and listened to David's excited description of a hawk he had seen hunting in the meadow. The sun was setting behind the Tetons, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Fiona thought about how different this moment was from that day 10 years ago when she had stood crying over a burned pot of stew, certain that her life was over. That night, after the children were asleep and the evening chores were done, Fiona and Daniel sat together on the porch as they had so many times before. The stars were emerging one by one in the darkening sky, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and sage from the mountains. "Do you remember what you said that first night?" Fiona asked. "About land-claiming people," Daniel nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "I do." "You were right," she said. "This land claimed me a long time ago, even before I understood what that meant. But you claimed my heart, Daniel Quinn, and that is a better kind of belonging than I ever imagined possible." He pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other in the midst of struggle and built something beautiful from loss and hope and burned stew. The ranch that had nearly failed now thrived, the family that had died out now flourished with new life, and the loneliness that had threatened to consume them, both had been transformed into a love that would endure for all the years to come. The seasons turned, as they always do in Wyoming. Winter came with its harsh cold and heavy snows. Spring brought the melting and the birth of new calves and foals. Summer filled the days with long light and hard work, and autumn painted the aspens gold before the cycle began again. Through all of it, Fiona and Daniel worked side by side, their partnership deepening with each passing year. David grew tall and strong, eventually taking on more and more responsibility for the horse operation until, at 19, he was running it almost entirely on his own. He had his father's calm way with animals and his mother's determination, a combination that served him well. Ellen proved to have not just a head for figures but a sharp business sense that made her invaluable when it came time to negotiate sales or plan for the future. And Thomas, as they had suspected, had a gift for animal husbandry, able to spot illness or distress in the livestock before anyone else noticed a problem. In 1895, when Fiona and Daniel were in their mid-30s and the children were becoming adults in their own right, they faced their greatest challenge yet. A group of investors from the East arrived in Jackson, buying up smaller ranches and consolidating them into a massive operation that threatened to push out the independent ranchers who had built the valley. The investors approached Daniel and Fiona with an offer to purchase their land for what seemed like an enormous sum, enough to retire on and live comfortably for the rest of their days. They sat at the kitchen table that night, the offer letter spread between them, and looked at each other across the worn wood that bore the marks of years of family meals and business planning. "What do you want to do?" Daniel asked, though Fiona could see in his eyes that he already knew the answer. "This is our home," she said simply. "Our children's home. We built this together from nothing, from burned stew and borrowed time. I am not selling it to people who see it as nothing more than numbers on a ledger." Daniel smiled, that warm expression she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I was hoping you would say that," he said, "because I cannot imagine leaving this place. My roots go too deep now." They refused the offer, and though the investors tried to pressure them and some of the other holdout ranchers, eventually the Eastern Corporation moved on to more profitable ventures elsewhere. The valley remained largely in the hands of the families who had built it, and the sense of community among them grew stronger for having faced the threat together. On a warm summer evening in 1897, 15 years after Daniel had first ridden onto the Vaughn homestead, the family gathered for a celebration. David had announced his engagement to a young woman from a neighboring ranch, and the wedding was planned for the following spring. Ellen was courting a schoolteacher who had come west from Boston, and Thomas was taking classes in veterinary medicine through a correspondence course, determined to bring modern animal health practices to the valley. As Fiona looked around at her children, at their happiness and their confidence in the future, she felt Daniel's hand find hers under the table. She squeezed it, and he squeezed back, a wordless conversation they had perfected over the years. Later, when the children had gone to their own cabins, which Daniel had built for them on the property as they had grown, Fiona and Daniel walked up the hillside to visit her parents' graves. It had become a tradition for them, coming here on important occasions to share their news with the people who had started it all. "Your daughter married a drifter," Daniel said to the headstones with a smile. "But I promise you, I stopped drifting the day I met her. She gave me a home, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that gift." Fiona leaned against him, looking out over the ranch that sprawled below them, lights twinkling from the main house and the various outbuildings and cabins. "They would have loved you," she said. "My father would have appreciated how hard you work, and my mother would have adored the way you look at me." "How do I look at you?" Daniel asked, turning her to face him. "Like I am the most precious thing in the world," she said. "Like you did that first day when you ate my terrible stew and told me it was delicious." He laughed and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You are the most precious thing in my world," he said seriously. "You and the family we built together. Everything good in my life started the day I saw smoke rising from this property and decided to investigate." "Best decision you ever made?" she asked teasingly. "Second best," he corrected. "The best decision was eating that stew and asking if I could stay." They stood together on the hillside as the stars emerged, the same stars that had watched over them on that night by the fire pit when they had first confessed their love, the same stars that had shone down on their wedding day and on the births of their children, and on every significant moment of their shared life. The land stretched out around them, the land that had claimed them both and bound them together, the land they had fought for and nurtured and loved. Years continued to pass, marked by weddings and grandchildren, by successful cattle sales and challenging seasons, by the slow, steady rhythm of ranch life. David married his sweetheart and built a house on the eastern edge of the property, where he raised horses and eventually 4 children of his own. Ellen married her schoolteacher, and they settled in Jackson, where she managed the business affairs not just for the family ranch but for several other operations in the valley. Thomas completed his veterinary studies and set up a practice that served the entire region, though he always made time to care for the Quinn family livestock personally. Fiona and Daniel grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces becoming more lined, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it grew deeper and richer with each passing year, seasoned by shared experience and mutual respect. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative, had faced loss and celebrated triumph, had built something that would outlast them both. On a crisp autumn morning in 1912, 30 years after that fateful day when Daniel had first arrived, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Fiona was 62 now, Daniel 66, and though they still worked the ranch, they had handed over most of the day-to-day operations to David and Thomas. It was a strange feeling, this stepping back, but also a peaceful one. "You have any regrets?" Fiona asked, a question that had been on her mind lately as she reflected on the life they had built together. Daniel considered for a long moment, his hand finding hers as it always did. "Only one," he said finally, and Fiona felt her heart clench. "I regret that I did not find you sooner. Every day I spent without you feels like a day wasted," Relief and love flooded through her. "We found each other when we were meant to," she said. "Everything that happened before brought us to that moment when you rode onto my property and changed my life." "Our life," he corrected gently. "It has always been our life, from the moment I tasted that stew." Fiona laughed, the sound carrying across the yard and making their grandchildren look up and wave. "You are never going to let me forget that stew, are you?" "Never," Daniel agreed cheerfully. "It is the foundation of our entire relationship. Someday our great-grandchildren will tell the story of how their great-grandfather fell in love with their great-grandmother over the worst meal ever cooked in Wyoming territory." "It was not the worst," Fiona protested, but she was smiling. "It really was," Daniel insisted, pulling her close and kissing her temple. "But it was also the best thing I ever tasted because it led to this. All of this. You, our children, our grandchildren, this ranch, this life. I would eat 1,000 burned stews for this, Fiona." She turned in his arms and kissed him properly, not caring that their grandchildren were giggling and pointing at them. "I love you, Daniel Quinn," she said. "Thank you for eating my terrible stew and for staying to eat everything else I cooked after that." "Thank you for burning that stew in the first place," he replied, "and for letting me stay, for building this life with me, for loving me even when I was just a drifter with nothing to offer but a willingness to work and a lie about how delicious burned food could be." They sat together on the porch as the afternoon sun slanted golden across the valley. Two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and loneliness and had created something beautiful together. The ranch that Fiona's parents had started, that she had nearly lost, that Daniel had helped her save, now thrived under the management of their children and would one day pass to their grandchildren, a legacy of love and hard work and partnership. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, the Tetons that had watched over them through all the seasons of their life together. The cattle grazed peacefully in the meadows, the horses ran in the pastures, and smoke rose from the chimneys of the various homes scattered across the property, carrying with it the scent of cooking and warmth and family. Fiona thought about that day 30 years ago, when she had stood crying over a burned pot of stew, certain that her world was ending. She thought about the stranger who had appeared like a miracle, who had eaten that awful meal and told her it was delicious, who had stayed to help her and ended up staying forever. She thought about all the years between then and now, the struggles and the joys, the children and the cattle, the winters and the summers, the endless cycle of ranch life that had become as natural to her as breathing. "I would do it all again," she said suddenly, and Daniel looked at her with those amber eyes that still made her heart skip after all these years. "Do what again?" he asked. "All of it," she said. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I would burn that stew again, just to have you ride onto my property and into my life. I would live through every hard moment if it meant getting to be here with you now." Daniel's eyes grew bright with emotion, and he cupped her face in his weathered hands. "You are the great love of my life, Fiona Quinn," he said, his voice rough. "You were worth riding across half the continent to find, worth every moment of wandering I did before I found you. You made me whole." "We made each other whole," she corrected, and kissed him again as the sun continued its slow descent toward the mountains. They remained on the ranch for the rest of their days, watching their family grow and flourish, watching the land they had fought for become more prosperous than they had ever imagined possible. Daniel passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1921 at the age of 75, with Fiona holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. His last words were simple: "Best stew I ever tasted." Fiona followed him 4 years later in the spring of 1925, at the age of 75. In her final days, She asked to be taken up to the hillside where her parents and Daniel were buried, where wildflowers bloomed thick and beautiful. As she looked out over the ranch, over the land that had claimed her and the family that had saved her, she smiled. "I am coming," she whispered to the wind. "Wait for me, my love. We have more years ahead of us, whatever comes next." She was buried beside Daniel, their headstones standing side by side as they had stood side by side in life. And on both stones was carved a simple phrase that their children had chosen: "Together in all things." The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, the Quinn name becoming synonymous with quality and integrity throughout Wyoming. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the hillside where 4 graves stood watched over by the eternal mountains, people swore they could hear the sound of laughter, the kind that comes from 2 people who found each other against all odds and built a love that transcended even death. The story of Daniel and Fiona became legend in the valley, passed down through generations of their family, and retold to anyone who would listen. It became a story about love and perseverance, about kindness and second chances, about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best things we will ever experience. But mostly, it became known as the story of the cowboy who ate the burned stew and stayed for love, and the woman who learned that sometimes salvation comes riding in on a dusty horse when you least expect it. Their great-grandchildren would gather on the porch of the old home place, the same porch where Daniel and Fiona had sat for so many years, and they would tell the story to their own children. They would talk about the smoke rising from the cabin and the tears streaming down a young woman's face, about the stranger who stopped to help, and the terrible stew he ate with every appearance of enjoyment, about the lie that became the foundation of a truth that lasted for decades. The ranch stood as a testament to that love, its fields green and its herds healthy, its buildings sturdy and its fences strong. The Quinn family continued to work the land with the same dedication and care that Daniel and Fiona had brought to it, honoring the sacrifice and the vision of the 2 people who had turned a failing homestead into a thriving operation through nothing more than hard work, partnership, and a love that had been forged in smoke and tears and burned stew. And on the hillside, under the vast Wyoming sky, 4 headstones stood watch over it all, silent witnesses to the truth that the best things in life often come from the worst moments, and that sometimes the most delicious meal you will ever eat is the one that brings you home.